Welcome back, everyone, to Profluence Sports. Excited today to get my man Steve Delsohn on, who is doing amazing things in the PR, communications, executive, promotion space, which I'll let you touch on. But he's also gotten a lot of great guests on Profluence, right? And so I wanted to bring him in today just to talk about how founders can approach the space and what he's doing. And so anyway, Steve, appreciate you hopping on, and really excited for this educational one. I'm excited to learn from you and your unique spot in the space with mainly sports people.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Give us a little background, right? You have Delsohn Strategies now, which is your own company, but your previous endeavors, you did a lot of cool things as well, and just eventually wanted to do it yourself. So if you can give us some of that to start off, and then we'll dive deeper.
Okay. So I was a journalist for most of my adult life. I was an investigative reporter for Outside the Lines on ESPN TV for 16 years. I've written 12 nonfiction books, probably more than half sports, and then co-produced 2 documentaries. One was for the History Channel. It was about firefighters. It was based on a book I wrote about firefighters. And then I also did one of the first 10-30 firsts at ESPN when they first launched that series.
Nice.
So that's what I did previously. And then I took a lot of those skills and contacts and moved into strategic communications. I opened up my own company. It's actually called Delsohn Strategies. And if you want to get into it, there's a little bit of a story about transitioning from being a journalist to going into...
Yeah, I'd love to hear that story, but I want to go to one thing first. Any particular reason of sports? Like, were you a fan? Did you grow up playing it? Why has a lot of your focus been in this side of the industry?
Yeah, I grew up playing football and basketball in the Chicago Public League. I was your basic sports nut. And then I actually walked on the freshman basketball team at the University of Arizona.
Nice.
Back in the day when they still had freshman teams, we were basically just cannon fodder for the varsity. And we also had a psychotic coach who ran us more than the varsity ran. But anyway, yeah, I was around sports pretty much my whole life. And then I was going to be a lawyer, I thought. So did my parents. And I decided to change majors and go into journalism. And I'll never forget telling my dad that I was going to be a sports writer instead of a lawyer. And there was dead silence on the phone. And then to his credit, when I started to be, a little bit successful, he was my biggest fan. But I think it was a little bit of a shock to their system. But yeah, a long-winded way of saying I grew up, playing a lot of sports. And
nice.
Also coached girls basketball for 13 years in California.
Cool. Nice. You any championships or
yeah?
How's the coaching?
Yeah. It was pretty good, actually.
Nice.
A little bit obsessive, as my wife would, I watched a lot of Gino Auriemma tapes and Bobby Hurley Sr. My theory was, if I steal these guys' drills, I don't have to worry if they're good drills, practice drills. Like if it works for Gino, it's probably going to work for my 8th grade girls basketball team. So yeah, it was fun though. Actually, I loved that.
Yeah, super cool. So give us a transition a little bit, right? You're doing all this cool documentary stuff, journalism. What got you into Delsohn Strategies and the transition? How was that?
It was hard. So in 2017, it was all over the news that ESPN was going to lay off about 100 journalists. Since then, they've had a bunch of layoffs, but this was like the first really big one. And there were some big names, not me. I was solid and respected, but there were people like Andy Katz, Ed Wirtz, some people that nobody saw coming. And they laid off 100 people at once. I thought I was going to make it and not get laid off because I had just had a big investigative piece 3 weeks ago that was really good. My career was kind of humming along. And then actually on a Tuesday, I won 2 journalism awards, 2 more, for a story I did on a New York Giant who died at age 27. And they found out afterwards that he had CT, even though he hadn't played professional football very long. So on Tuesday, I won 2 awards for that piece from a film and TV festival in New York. And that aside, I thought I was going to make it. And then Wednesday comes and you can already see people like on the East Coast in particular, reporters tweeting that they got laid off. And I live in California and I was like, I'm I'm glued to Twitter. And then I get a phone call from 860 area code, which is Bristol, Connecticut, where ESPN is. And it's not a number I recognize. It's not like one of my buddies or one of my bosses. Mm-hmm. I was like, I'm done. And so we get on the phone. It's an executive who I wasn't crazy about. That was just the cherry on top. He was more of a suit than a journalist. There was an HR person on who didn't really want to be on, but she had to be. And it was like a 3-minute conversation. We're letting you go. And they said, we're going to honor your contract. And right at the end of the conversation, my reporter's instincts kind of kicked in. I said, so let me just reiterate, you're going to honor my contract.
Hmm.
So I wanted that said as many times as possible. And they said, yeah. So hung up the phone. I was in shock. I called my wife. I said, she worked in an office. I said, don't come home. I'm fine. She jumped in the car and came home. And we just sat there kind of in shock. And it was scary. I was like 59 at the time, I think, and had never been laid off. And I had no clue what I was going to do next. And then I looked for a journalism job. And there were some possibilities, but I was kind of spoiled because I worked at Outside the Lines for 16 years. And I didn't want to move to like Detroit necessarily and run a local investigative team, even though I liked Detroit. So I just looked, and then I finally got offered a job by a big PR firm, and we talked for like 8 months. And by the time they offered me a job, they had just started working with Harvey Weinstein. And I said, no, thanks. Even though I would never even meet the guy, they wanted me to like beef up their sports division. I just didn't want to be associated with a PR firm that was willing to work with him. So that was surreal because I was hell-bent on getting a full-time job. And when I finally got offered, I said no.
Yeah.
That was really bizarre, actually. So anyway, somebody said to me, you've got enough of a brand to open up your own shop. And I thought they were kidding. And then somebody else said it to me. A second friend said it to me. And I thought, I said to my wife, I'm going to stop looking for a full-time job. I'm going to open up my own shop, which was a huge leap of faith because I didn't have a clue what I was doing. And I had never thought about PR in my life. So I opened up my own shop. It's called Delsohn Strategies. And so that was kind of the transitional period.
Nice. So and I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but what's the crux of it now? What's some of the main projects you work on? And, what does that look like for the most part?
So I primarily do one thing for my clients and one thing only, but I think I'm particularly good at it. I get them media coverage, and I've been able to stay in the range of what I call, from high-end media coverage to pretty high-end. So high-end might be the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, on the sports side, ESPN, Sports Business Journal. Pretty high-end might be the Boston Globe or the Miami Herald. And typically I operate on 2 tracks. I get media coverage specifically about my client, like maybe Forbes will write a piece about my client, or the CEO will go on a podcast like this one and talk about their organization, but it's about my client. But then the second thing I do is I position their top executives, maybe just their CEO, maybe their president, maybe a few people, as national experts who can talk about specific issues in their industry. So if the Wall Street Journal is doing a piece on a particular issue, they'll think about my client as an interviewee. And usually I've already reached out to that reporter and made them aware of my client and what they can talk about. And then the third piece, which is kind of interrelated, is while I'm raising the profile of these organizations by getting them more media coverage, I'm raising the profile of their top executives, because somebody's got to be out there talking to the media. And to me, it's the same thing. If the CEO is getting interviewed a lot, that's good for the organization. If I'm getting a written piece in Forbes where they talk to the CEO for a minute, but they still write a piece, that's good for the CEO. So it's all interrelated. So bottom line, I'm raising my clients' profiles by getting them more media coverage. And it's typically national media coverage unless there's a reason to go after something local.
Super cool. And from the founder lens, right? A lot of founders, I think it's becoming more popular now, but like the personal brand standpoint, right? And you say you put a big emphasis on that of like, yeah, the company, but we need the top people. Any you see doing a good job, or like, what's the key to also to become that? Obviously going through you helps a lot as you condense all the relationships, but what are ways to build that personal brand? What are ways to stand out, right, amongst often, especially increasingly in sports, noisy sectors? Like you might think you're building the most unique thing in the world, but everyone else thinks you're like 10 other companies.
Yeah. And I have to explain that to my clients sometimes, like what you're living your company. And so it's fascinating to you, but I don't know if it's fascinating to Pat McAfee or, Brian Windhorse, so, and I say that gently. One of my mantras for taking on a client is, do I have a fighting chance to be successful? And if I don't, I will not sign them because I do not want to take their money and they don't get anything out of it. That makes me a little different I'm different than big PR firms in a lot of ways, but that's one of them. I think most big PR firms just sign you and then they hope they can get stuff for you. But as far as standing out, I mean, this is kind of corny, but I really believe it. I think the more real you are when you're being interviewed, authentic's probably an overused word to a degree, but if you go on and you're real, and I always tell my clients, like, what do you know before they do an interview? Like, what do you know about your industry that the rest of us don't know? Like, don't tell me stuff that's interesting when we're having a beer, and then when you're being interviewed, start just getting real safe and generic. Industry jargon can be a killer. If the only person that knows what you're talking about is the guy in the cubicle next to you, that's not good. Talk like a human being. But I mean, just honesty, really, I think is really actually kind of overlooked when you're doing an interview. And I understand you can't tell the media everything. Sometimes you can. But I think just being honest, being straightforward, answering the question instead of going in with 8 talking points that have nothing to do with the questions you're being asked. Try to be relatively succinct. Like, I'm going to stop now and I'm going to let you back into the interview. You're the host. So, so there's nothing revolutionary about those ideas. That's as far as being interviewed. And then, you have to decide if you're a founder. One of the things that I hear a lot actually from people is that if it's a kind of organization or company that raises money, is looking for investors. I've heard this a lot of times and I've seen it too to an extent. But when I get them a lot of media coverage, they say that it sometimes helps them get meetings with people, potential funders, say, or partners that they maybe weren't getting before, which I'm not even sure that makes sense. But for some reason, if somebody sees you in the Wall Street Journal or ESPN or Sports Business Journal and you sound like you're intelligent and your company or product is good, that can increase your credibility and your gravitas. So, I told somebody just the other day he said, do you think I'm ready to do PR? And I said, no. Because they're in between gigs. They have like a big resume, but they're in between gigs. And they knew that I get executives interviewed. And I told them, I said, don't spend money right now, like save your money and let's figure it out when you know what you're going to do next, because it's hard to get media coverage sometimes for people that are in between jobs, unless it's like Steph Curry, is in between jobs. So,
of course. Yeah, no, I think it's really great advice. And I'd say, sitting on this side, I think we're up into the 220s, maybe even 230s now of these podcasts. And it's quite interesting. You can see people that have done a lot of them or really know what they're doing versus the people that don't, or that, like you said, they don't answer questions direct. It's like, just answer it, right? And then you can always ask to sort of go beyond. And I think the transparency is a huge one. The people that just open up. And I get there is a fine line of how much you can say sometimes, but more often than not, I feel like people way undershare, where it's like, even if you shared that, like, people still got to go execute on it. It's just an idea, and treating them more like just conversations. And then to your social proof point, I'd say, like, really, like, yeah, you're in the PR communications business, but you're very much in the relationship business. And so by people using you, they get access to those relationships, and then it stamps that social proof of Wall Street Journal or whatever. And now it feels like, hey, that founder, like, why would someone, a partner or potential investor, be more interested? It's like, well, someone stamped them to get them there, and then that big firm stamped them. So, like, they're doing something right. So I think a lot of times it just shows you're doing something right to stand out.
Yeah. And the good, just playing off that, I think too, like the Wall Street Journal, I work with good reporters, good podcast hosts, they're not interviewing stiffs or pretenders. So you see a really good reporter in the Wall Street Journal trusted a CEO enough to include him in an article or write about him, that tends to mean that person is legit. And that's something, actually, relationship wise, I will do that too. Like, if once I start working with somebody and I see that they're gracious and we're probably going to be working together for a while, if there's anybody I know that would be helpful for them to know, I will offer to make an introduction. And that happens all the time, actually. So yeah, so once we start working together, to a certain degree, now you've kind of tapped into my Rolodex, and that's just like an added bonus. But I've worked with like 3 different college conferences, and I also work with like a lot of sports tech companies. And so there's been times where I've gone to the conference and say, hey, would you be open to having a conversation with this sports tech company in the college sports industry? And they'll do it. They may or may not work with them, but
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, even here at Profluence, a lot of people don't know this. I don't think I've ever talked about this publicly even too, but like we have pretty I've never disclosed it to anybody, but I have criteria on the back end of guests we even take, right? So it's like we've tried to, and so I'm sure Wall Street Journal, Forbes, all of them have criteria as well, or so
Yeah,
now
they do.
for I guess like what you talk about, this company needs a fighting chance, right? Or this founder needs a fighting chance to get, that's before you even take them on. What is increasing their chances? Or like what are maybe on the flip side, what are like why maybe they don't have a fighting chance, right? And how can they reverse engineer that to give themselves a chance where they can use you, or however they want to go about it?
I mean, one thing that can hurt, obviously, and I won't sign them, frankly, is if they're toxic. If the word gets out that they're bad to their employees, or, they're not honest. But as far as, part of it is one of the big things is, I mentioned those two tracks, media coverage specifically about them, and then positioning their CEO as an expert who can talk about national issues. On the second one, that's one of the criteria is, do they have expertise on timely issues so that they can be interviewed as an expert? So, for instance, I have several clients that can talk credibly about the House settlement, House v. NCAA. They can talk about NIL. They can talk about revenue sharing. So that's one thing, is can they talk about issues that reporters and podcasters care about? I work with the CEO of the Grammys, and sometimes he gets interviewed about stuff related to the Grammys. Sometimes he's talking more broadly about the future of AI and music. So that's one thing. Like, can your CEO talk about things that are relevant today? And usually the answer is yes. And then, more broadly, just, are you far enough along if it's a company and your company's, do you have something? You might have a wonderful idea, but no results yet. And that may be too early to try to get media coverage. So you just have to be kind of real honest with yourself about, are we far enough along? And I'm very honest with people too. If they're not far enough along, I tell them what I told that other guy the other day, is just save your money, do your thing, get some traction, and then let's talk when it makes sense.
Yeah. And from a, like when you're going to reporters or journalists, what are you saying? Do they just trust you now over years of time, or like, what is that process? And obviously I'm sure there's a lot of nuance, and that's, a lot of the reason why people pay you, but like, I'm just curious, like do you really have to pitch them, right? I'm sure some, it's not always just a yes, like what then goes into, okay, yeah, I can work with them. And then here's where we want to get the company or the CEO positioned. What do you really bring to them? Are you working, is it just off the relationship? Is it you have, like, you work together with the founder company to put together materials? Or I'm just curious on that intermediary phase.
Yeah, so there's different things. So like sometimes there's actually a third track I operate on. Sometimes it's, can we come up with a specific story angle? So I'm not asking the reporter to write about my client. I'm not saying my CEO can talk about this, 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 and this. We're pitching a specific story angle. Like, for instance, I worked with a woman that used to work in the Obama Labor Department. And during COVID, the current Labor Department was reporting that there were 10 million Americans actively looking for a job and were unemployed, at the same time that there were 9.8 open jobs. So we came up with this story hook. If there's 10 million unemployed people and almost 10 million open jobs, what's going on? So, and I do that a lot. So you come up with a story angle, and then because you gave the reporter the idea in the first place, and because your client is completely qualified to talk about it, their interview, their quotes may get threaded throughout the entire article. So that's one thing, is coming up with a specific angle. And then if it's a CEO, or the CEO of the Grammys, for instance, I could probably just say he's the CEO of the Grammys, but he's also this really accomplished songwriter and producer who's made music with Beyonce and John Legend and Aretha Franklin, and he's done movie scoring for Shrek and Straight Outta Compton. So it's sending a tight, concrete pitch, whether it's for a story idea or explaining an executive. And more is not more when you pitch people, because these reporters get bombarded. The other thing I do is I'll reach out on LinkedIn or Twitter and just say, hey, in case you get a ton of email, which they do, this is just a heads up that I'm sending you one about a potential story.
Got it.
99% of the time, they're cool with that. Every once in a while, somebody gets fussy and say, how dare you hit me up on LinkedIn.
Whatever. Yeah. I'm doing your job for you. So I mean that's sort of the through line of it, right? Like if you can do a lot of the work for them, then it makes it easy. Is sort of if you piece that all together, hey, I came up with a good story for you and I brought the person to talk about it. Steve Dolson, like I did a lot of the work for you, reporter. It makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of the preliminary work, they have to, and
Correct.
the big key is not pitching on what I call PR bullshit.
Yeah.
Pitching them an actual story or an actual expert because they can tell the difference between what's a legitimate story possibly for them and what's just PR BS. So once reporters, media know that you're not going to pitch them garbage, and that for me, it's also like, because I was an accomplished reporter, I may have more credibility with journalists to a degree than more
I'd hope
approaches
so.
because I did it. And so, not to say that people at other PR firms don't have credibility, but that's something I do have going for me, I think.
Yeah.
What you did, I was pretty good at it. I know what a story is, I know what a story is not.
From sports, you said you have a lot of sports tech clients now. What are you seeing, right? You've been in the space for a while. You've covered a lot of trends. You've covered a lot of different companies. What are you seeing in this wave right now? Where are you dealing a lot? Where do you see the space going? I'm curious from a macro perspective. You have a unique angle on the space, working hand to hand with a lot of the change makers in it.
Are you talking about sports broadly or sports tech?
You're choosing, right? I'd say there's overlap, obviously,
Yeah,
but you could pick one if there's one you're more deep
yeah.
into.
Well, this is obvious. You do a great job, by the way, if you don't mind me giving you a compliment, of
Thank you.
covering sports trends and where the industry is going. So you know this a lot better than I do. But I noticed that one of the things that you write about is youth sports. And I think that's definitely a growth industry. Hopefully it'll be people that care about the kids that are doing youth sports and don't see it just as a way to make money. But youth sports, I think, is definitely growing. AI, obviously, and all these athletes now, seems like it's almost expected to a degree that they're going to be entrepreneurial now, which they should be. There's athletes making more money off the court. It used to be just Michael Jordan, everybody said, was making more off the court than on the court. Now there's, so I think,
Yeah.
athletes as entrepreneurs, do sports, AI. Those are kind of the ones that jump out. A little obvious, but
Yeah, no, and I think they tie in, right? I think you've had more NIL college sports clients as well,
yeah, I've had a lot of that.
so that's a big space.
Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, like, what if you had to narrow it down? What in the sports industry is really growing?
Yeah, I mean, I focus on two areas: the emerging leagues and youth sports. That's where I say a lot of the increased interest in number one capital wants to flow to, and then everything that's affiliated around that, right? So you see a lot of the investment banks that go, well, what are the top companies, because we want to broker them to the capital providers, and I think those are two really hot areas right now. But
And when you say emerging leagues, like, give me a hypothetical, like an example.
yeah, TGL, Unrivaled. You see like T10 cricket. You see 3-on-3 basketball. You see all these emerging different alternative versions of maybe traditional sports,
Yeah.
but just even new leagues, right? Where it was like live golf, right? It's the same thing, just innovated a little bit. So you're just seeing, partially because of AI, like sports is this last place for media content, live eyeballs, and no matter what happens with tech, bringing people together to watch sports is never going away, and you can always sell into those communities. So I think those are why those are two hot areas, and they're really one and the same if you think about it, because even you say youth sports and emerging leagues. Well, youth sports are leagues in themselves anyway. It's just, you don't call it that because they're way more fragmented and the players come and go. So those would be the two hot areas. But yeah, man, this has been great, Steve. I guess as we close out, where can people learn more about you? Do you have a website, email? Obviously, you're a member of Profluence, which is amazing and we're appreciative of. But where can people get to you or make their pitch and maybe hopefully work with you one day?
Sure. So there's a website, Delsohn.com, and it's DELSOHN. Or you can email me, steve@delson.com.
Amazing.
Yeah. And I'm
Awesome.
happy to talk to particularly any Profluence members, and you're doing a great job with
For sure.
Profluence. I think it's very interesting and very concrete for the members. I get something out of it pretty much
Amazing.
every single day if I can go on there every day. So.
Amazing. Love to hear that.